In this lesson, we will do a brief topical study to illustrate how you might begin to conduct your own. We will be researching what the Bible says about a topic and putting together what we find. It is possible that after this study that you might be able to present a lesson on this topic, write a blog post, or something similar. Let's get started. The topic we will be looking at is assumptions. An assumption is when you think you have the answer to a question, but you may have concluded too soon. Perhaps you came to a conclusion without knowing all the facts, or perhaps you filled in the facts in your own mind, whether they are true or not. What does the Bible say about assumptions? Are there bad or sinful times that we assume? Can we learn something about the consequences of assumptions? Let's begin our topical study with some searching. We will first think of some key words that we might search for in the Bible that have to do with our topic. Remember that the Bible writers weren't thinking about your topical study when they wrote. They may not have used the same words you would use, and therefore we have to be flexible in our search. For this study, we will be using the King James Version Bible. We can start with our main topic word, assumptions. When we search for that, we get no results. Let's try some variations of that same word. Let's look for assume. Nothing. What about assuming? Still nothing. Let's search for different words that have the same meaning or have to do with something similar. A thesaurus is a book that lists words with similar meanings. Consulting a thesaurus might help you to think of similar words for which to search. In this case, we are dealing with making a decision about something. Another word for that would be a conclusion. A search for conclusion gives us a result. But this verse is not really relevant to making assumptions or thinking incorrectly. Let's search for another word to see if someone jumped to a conclusion or assumed. So let's search for supposed. Now we have 8 matches in 8 verses. The first match is Matthew 20:10. This is a parable about laborers in the vineyard. This verse says something about people supposing or assuming something and being incorrect. Let's add that to our list of verses to look at later and possibly include in our study and lesson. When we scroll through the results, we also come to Acts 21:29. This verse is talking about people supposing that Paul had brought someone into the temple. If we click on the verse reference, we can see more of the context surrounding the verse. Looking at the verses before and after the reference should help us to see what is going on. Starting in verse 27, we see, "And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people, and laid hands on him, crying out, 'Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people, and the law, and this place. And further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place.' For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar." These verses are dealing with Jews who assumed that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple area. Gentiles were not allowed in the temple area. By assuming Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple, they thought the temple was unclean or defiled. They now wanted to kill Paul. This is the type of verse we are looking for. It shows us the example of people assuming, and it shows the consequences of it. We will definitely add these verses to our list. There is not much left in this search. Now let's search for think. Just to limit our results into something easier, let's restrict our search to New Testament verses. We can always go back and search only the Old Testament verses later if we want. Now we have 47 matches in 44 verses. It might take a bit of time to scroll through a search, but this is a lot faster and easier than reading through the Bible until you come to something. Remember that if you are not using a digital Bible, a concordance can help you with searches. Our first match is Matthew 3:9. Here, John the Baptist is warning the Jews not to think too much about their relationship to Abraham. If God wanted more children of Abraham, he could raise them from the stones. Our salvation is not dependent on who our father is. This verse will work for our search because it shows people concluding too much based on their thinking. These Jews think they are safe because they are related to Abraham, but they have filled in the facts in their own mind thinking their relationship to Abraham makes them safe, but their facts are wrong. Scrolling down, we come to Matthew 9:4, where Jesus talks about thinking evil. Clicking on the verse gives us the context of Jesus healing someone by saying, "Thy sins be forgiven thee." This was a claim to be deity, because only God can forgive sins. The scribes thought Jesus was blaspheming. Jesus said their thinking was evil. Why? Because the scribes thought something negative about Jesus which wasn't true. Jesus really was deity. This is a good verse for our list because it shows people thinking something negative about someone else without finding out or believing the facts. Now that you have seen the beginning of the process, we will condense the process so that we may move more quickly through the lesson. Romans 12:3 is another verse to add to our list because it clearly says that we should not think too highly of ourselves. We should not assume that we are so great and fill our heads with facts about our greatness that may not be true. 1 Corinthians 12:23 is a verse that is talking about thinking less of others. In the context, Paul uses an analogy about the parts of the body functioning together as a unit to describe how the different members of the church should function together. The context goes on to say that we should have the same care for one another. We should not think of other members as unimportant. We'll add that verse to our list. Finally, Galatians 6:3 tells us that if we think we are something when we are really nothing, we deceive ourselves. Again, the caution is not to think too highly of ourselves. The context talks about bearing each other's burdens. When other people sin, help them with meekness, and don't use it as an opportunity to build yourself up as great. We may be able to find more, but this will probably suffice for the point of our demonstration. Let's summarize what we have found out. We will list each verse that we added to our list and think about what it can demonstrate or teach. Matthew 20:10. This verse is a good example of an incorrect assumption. It demonstrates how we can think one thing and it turns out to be wrong. This might be a good verse to start with if we were building a lesson because it demonstrates the possibility of assumption. Acts 21:29. This verse shows the dangers of incorrect assumption. This is technically what we would call evil surmising. That is, when you don't know all the facts, so you assume something negative or evil is true. In this case, some Jews thought Paul had defiled the temple, which was not true, and so they wanted to kill him. Evil surmisings are sinful and deadly. Matthew 3:9. This verse shows how we can be mistaken about something we thought was true. The Jews were God's chosen people, but that didn't mean that they could just depend upon their lineage for their salvation. This verse might be used to demonstrate that just because one thing is true doesn't mean you can carry that truth too far into the realm of assumption. Matthew 9:4. Here the scribes thought something evil about Jesus because they did not know or believe the facts. Get the facts before you assume. Romans 12:3. This verse shows that sometimes our assumptions are about ourselves and they may not be correct. Specifically, we may think too highly of ourselves and fill in all sorts of great information in our minds about ourselves, even if the information is not true. Don't assume about yourself. 1 Corinthians 12:23. This verse lets us know not to assume someone is lesser than ourselves. Paul lets the church in Corinth know that just because they are different doesn't mean that anyone is unimportant. Galatians 6:3. This verse lets us know that we should not think too highly of ourselves. In the context of this verse, building ourselves up as great when someone else sins may lead to our downfall. Don't think you are so great that you can't fall. Now that we have our verses and our brief summaries of what they're showing us, let's organize them into a brief outline. This will help us see all of the different teachings together and could even work for a sermon, lesson, or blog post. First, the introduction will set up what the lesson is about. We explain that we are looking at what the Bible teaches about assumptions or thinking about things incorrectly. It may be because we don't have all the facts, or it may be that we have filled in the facts in our own minds, but we are wrong. The verses of Matthew 20, 1 through 13 will show us the parable and what is going on. Focusing on verse 10 will let us see how we can be incorrect in our assumptions. The first main point will be based on assumptions about other people. We will label the first point, Assumptions about Others. The first subpoint will be the scribes assumed something evil about Jesus. Jesus really was deity, but the scribes didn't know it or didn't believe it. Therefore, they thought something negative about Jesus. Matthew 9, 2 through 4 will work as verses for this. Focus on verse 4 to show that their thinking was evil. The second subpoint will be evil surmising about Paul. The Jews thought he had defiled the temple when he really had not, and they were going to kill him for it. Acts 21, 27 through 31 will work as verses for this. Focus on the word supposed in verse 29 to show that this was an assumption. The third subpoint will be thinking others in the church are unimportant. 1 Corinthians 12, 22 through 25 will work as verses for this. Focus on the words think to be less honorable in verse 23. The second main point will be based on assumptions about ourselves. The first subpoint will be the Jews assumed their lineage made them safe. While the Jews had some of the facts, they needed to go further and get all the facts. They still needed to repent. Matthew 3, 7 through 9 will work as verses to demonstrate this. Focus on verse 9 to show the assumption of the Jews. The second subpoint will be think soberly, not highly. Paul tells us that we should not think more highly of ourselves than we ought. Romans 12:3 will work as a verse for this. Focus on how we should not put a lot of extra information in our minds as to how great we are. We may end up assuming too much about ourselves and building ourselves up too much. The third subpoint will be not too high or you'll fall. Paul tells the Galatians that when someone sins, we are to help them with meekness. Meekness means strength under control. We are not to allow ourselves to be overly harsh with someone who has a fault. In other words, be in control and consider yourself so that you don't fall and sin too. Again, don't think too highly of yourself or your greatness, or you may fall too. Galatians 6, 1 through 3 will work as verses for this. Focus on verse 3 that says, For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Now for a brief conclusion on what we have learned. The Bible teaches that it is possible to assume something, but be incorrect. We should not assume something negative or evil about someone else without getting all the facts. Of course, the best place to get the facts is the source itself. We should also not assume something negative about someone else by assuming they are unimportant. We should not assume about ourselves by thinking that we are greater than we really are. We are not given a free pass to sin whether we are Jew or Christian. We are not to think too highly of ourselves. When others sin, we are not to think too highly of ourselves, or we might just end up falling too. Assumptions can involve sin. Deception can be involved, Galatians 6:3. Evil thinking can be involved, Matthew 9:4. Evil surmising can lead to other sins, even murder, Acts 21:29. In conclusion, we should not think evil about others without getting the facts or think lesser about people as if they are unimportant. We also should not think too highly of ourselves or we may fall into sin. Assumptions can involve sin and or lead to sin. Assumptions are dangerous and deadly. This has been a brief example of a topical study. Other topical studies may involve more verses, referencing dictionaries, commentaries, etc. However, this should show how you can begin doing a basic topical study by simply thinking about what you want to examine and then going to the Bible to see what it teaches about it.